Subscribe before we begin. If you want to see what the living tried to hide inside paper and light, this is the channel where I unseal it. I am alone in the studio when the portrait arrives, wrapped tight in brown paper and twined like a parcel that does not want to breathe. The hour is late enough that the timber beneath my chair gives a reluctant sigh every time I shift, and the racket of the city outside has thinned to the particular hush that magnifies the small sounds of work. The whisk of a horsehair brush, the click of a loop against glass, the quiet seethe of a scanner carriage as it crosses under fluorescent light. The air smells faintly of dust and fixer that has long dried into the grain of the counter, a ghost of the dark room where this prince ancestor was once bathed. I set the package down and read the short note that rides atop it, a thin ribbon of handwriting that is all apology and urgency. Please restore, the client has said, and please tell me if there is anything you find that I should know. The date they have scrawled on the mount back makes my fingers still for an instant. 1899. The turn of the century, late in the era when grief was a choreography with rules, when mourning was a uniform and a photograph could double as a goodbye. The portrait under the paper is a cabinet card, 8 by 10 inches on a cream mount gone the color of tea. The studio imprint along the bottom, an embossed scrollwork in gilt that has dimmed to brass, names a photographer on a high street in a northern town I only know from maps. The family in the image stands in a domestic setting rather than before a painted backdrop. A heavy curtain drawn back to reveal the corner of a parlor, a mahogany sideboard with a mirror that has been covered by a veil of muslin, a vase of lilies on a crocheted mat, and a patterned carpet at their feet that looks like it bites. I sit for a minute and simply look. This is always my first step, before the gloves, before the data capture, before even the lens. I let my eyes walk the room where the camera walked, and I measure what the lens chose to see. I keep, for days like this, a checklist that I refuse to write down. 7 signs that experience has taught me might tell the difference between a posed portrait and a relic of disaster. They are not absolute. The history of early photography is a thicket of exceptions. But when you work in the friction between what the camera reports and what the human hand edits, you learn to count. First, the eyes. In the late 19th century, photographers did not hesitate to improve an image with a retouching pencil or a sable brush, and the eyes were often the beneficiaries of that vanity, a little ink to sharpen the iris, a line to resuscitate a lash. But in postmortem images, there is a different usage entirely, a painterly fiction meant to animate eyelids that will not lift again. I lower my loupe, the little circle of magnification descending until it frames the face of the child at the center. He is perhaps 8 years old in a suit too new for him, with buttons that have not learned his hands. The eyes in the print return my gaze with a gleam that is almost too alert. And yet there is something about the catchlights, those glances of brightness that tell you where the window was. They are not in the same place from one eye to the other. Under magnification I can see the faint, dry brushstrokes on the left lid, the gloss of paint catching in the pores of paper fibers. The pupil on that side is not a hole in emulsion but a coin of pigment with a hesitant edge. I have seen this before. In a rush of hope for what might be hidden, families asked for the illusion of wakefulness. An empathetic hand obliged with ink. My heart does its small, unnecessary thing. I do not decide from one clue. I do what I always do, I document. I record the object first in the state in which it comes to me, a habit as much ethical as practical. I describe the mount's bevel, the corner's slight beveling that suggests hand-cutting rather than a machine guillotine, the faint smell of mildew that indicates the print's years in a damp chest. I open a condition report in my system and note down the damages. A crescent crease at the top edge where a careless thumb too often pulled it free. A constellation of foxing along the right margin, iron stains the color of dried blood. A tear that runs from the lower border into the carpet like a hairline crack in an icy river. And along all 4 edges, a delicate blue-silver sheen that catches the light obliquely. Silvering. Gelatin silver prints from this era carry their chemistry forward in time like a nervous habit, blooming out where the binder has exposed too much to air. On the surface of the image itself, I see micro-crazing, small cracks in the emulsion that spiderweb around highlights. You can hear them sometimes if you flex the paper, a soft privacy of sound like a whispering page. I never flex. I map the damages on a tracing mylar I overlay on the print, marking areas of concern in soft pencil. Desaturation in the mother's sleeve, abrasion across the father's shoe, a thumbprint I cannot help but resent near the central boy's collar. The map is a promise to future you will not forget where the fault lines are. Now the technical part begins. I clean the scanner glass twice, even though I cleaned it after the last job, with a microfiber cloth that tolerates no residue. I turn on the overhead polarizing lights and dim the room until the LEDs along my monitor are stars to steer by. I calibrate the monitor to D50 and a gamma of 2.2, the white point forgiving enough for paper that has browned with a century of grief. A color target goes first on the scanner bed so that the profiles know where true lies. I use archival nitrile gloves, though some restorers prefer bare hands for feel. I prefer to never leave myself inside a photograph. A soft anti-static brush lifts dust, my breath held because breath is the enemy of loose fibers. I place the print face down and, for fear of pressing into old bruises, used a hinged mylar sleeve to ferry it. Reflective scanning wants care with the lid. I cushion it with a black foam board to discourage bleed-through from the mount's reverse. The resolution I choose is 600 dpi, high enough to capture the minute detail I will need, a tight weave of wool, a brush hair, the difference in grain between paint and emulsion. I lock down the focus height to account for the thickness of the cardboard, and the first pass is made at neutral, unsharpened, color-corrected only to remove the distortions of the scanner itself. The light bar hums as it crosses beneath the weight of the past. It takes exactly long enough to be a ritual. While the scanner writes its stanza of light, I listen. It is a habit from my darkroom days, listening for the whisper of paper in trays, the tap of tongs against enamel, bubbles of chemical alchemy. Now I hear instead the wooden boards tick under the weight of old heat, and the radiator hisses like something that only pretends to sleep. When the scan completes, the image rises on the screen and I am always surprised. The monitor is not a lightbox, but for a moment it feels like one, illumination pressing through even the shadows. Second in my unwritten list is the gaze that is not a gaze, a vacancy that belongs to more than just a long exposure or a child obliged to stand still. Some 1890s portraits still required patience. Shutters were faster by then, lenses more hungry, but light is light and winter is winter. Even so, the eyes of those who are alive tend to aim. They find the lens or they find the person beside them. The father in this image has the faithful squint of a man who has worked outside, looking at the camera like he does not trust it. The mother looks not at me but just to the left of me, at someone who is not there or who is standing where I am standing in an odd loop of time. The little girl in the sailor dress leans into the hem of her mother, and her glance darts down, distracted by the weight of whatever has been pinched into her hair. Only the boy's eyes, which sit too bright in this room, do not settle. They hover, a misregistered printing plate, looking simultaneously at the lens and at a point within himself that I cannot reach. I zoom in until his pupil fills my screen like a black moon. The line of paint that completes it is a ridge, catching luminous, and there is no aperture here. Beneath the paint, the eyelid is round with what it hides. I put a pin in my mind, one sign that asks for a counterweight from the others. I let the cursor drift as if it were a finger. The jacket's lapel has been touched with something like chalk to raise the contrast. The father's watch chain is an anchor for the eye. The metal is bright but not polished bright. The brightness has been drawn on in graphite by a retoucher so that the line sings. I make notes for myself, areas of retouching to respect as part of the print's history, not to erase simply because I can. This is a rule in my work. I make things legible, I do not make them untrue. Third on my list is rigidity disguised as poise. The body that stands without pattern reveals itself in small losses. Hands that do not curve naturally, shoulders that set like stone, heads that do not tilt to greet light. I look at the boy's hands, which should be suggestive of fidget. They lie on his thighs as if placed there by a careful person who has rehearsed this placing many times. The fingers are too straight. On the ring finger of his left hand, the skin collapses not quite right where the knuckle should flex. There is, under the luster of the emulsion, a tiny indentation, almost imperceptible, as if something had been tied or wrapped there, something to anchor the hand that wants to slither away. Raking light photographs can reveal a world invisible in a flat scan. So I set up a low-angle LED to skim across the surface and take a second series that records the terrain, valleys of crease, mountain ridges of crackle, the hidden geography of a flat field. Under that oblique light, the hem of the boy's jacket lifts and what looks like a rod behind his calf throws the faintest of shadows. On the digital file, I dial the contrast and bring it up. There it is, faint enough that an unkind I might call it a defect in development, but crisp enough to betray its shape. The foot of a posing stand leg, the stiff vertical that once attached behind a sitter's back to discourage the human tendency to sway. The posing stand is a magician's assistant in studio photographs from this era, and its myths our own little mythology. The living needed it more than the dead. It steadied a chin, braced a spine, reminded muscles of their temporary duty to hold still. It could not hold the dead upright without some other deception of furniture and limb. In this image, the stand is behind the father. You can see its cuff like a bracelet at the base of his skull, a dot of darkness the size of a black pinhead if you know where to seek it. That it is not behind the boy argues one thing to one kind of believer and another to the rest. To the uninitiated, its absence might suggest he is alive, and to the initiated, its absence suggests the stand was not useful to what he is. I am not initiated, I am ruthless. I will not conclude. The checklist is what saves me from narrative greed. Fourth on my list is composition's betrayal. When people make a portrait to commemorate life, they do not often place a child at the geometric heart of the print unless they want you to know that the child is their axis. When they make a portrait to commemorate death, there is often a gravitational pull towards the center where the loss sits. I take the digital rectangle and overlay a grid to study the placement. The mother stands to the left with her body angled inwards, her arm a curve around the daughter. The father, to the right, crosses one leg over the other as if bracing, but his stance is outward, a wedge that both this image and whatever door they have closed behind the camera pushes against. Between them the boy stands like a pillar. He is doing what the father cannot do and the mother dares not. He holds the image up. He is perfectly central, so central that the lines of the carpet converge to his shoes. Even the lilies on the sideboard lean. I tear my gaze away because I can feel the story wanting to leap ahead of the signs. I take a breath that pretends to be objective because I have learned that my body will tell a story faster than my mind intends to. I move back to the object itself. The surface is clammy under the light, a quality of gelatin in humid air. I turn the print over to its reverse and find what I always hope for, pencil. Someone has written in a hand that belongs to the hands that touch bread and coal and pennies more than pens. Taken after, it begins and then the note stops. The rest has been rubbed by fingers. I tilt the card and look for graphite ghosts. Taken after, the fever, I can convince myself it says. Or perhaps it says, the fair, and the after will be of laughter instead. I refuse to be seduced. I photograph the reverse as carefully as the front, strike a note in the metadata, and walk away from my own wanting. I think of this as the ethical layer before the non-destructive layers, the part where I remind myself how easily intention can ruin evidence. The fifth sign is mourning that is not politely social but intensely private. Fashion speaks for those whose throats are too striped by tears to speak for themselves. It develops rituals, it codifies the chaos of sorrow. In the 1890s, widows wore crepe, a dull, matte black that drinks light and refuses to return it. Jet beading runs along the mother's collar in this image, and the beading is not the glossy black of evening, it is the heavy, sympathetic black of grief. Her sleeves are trimmed with crepe bands that do not catch the highlights the way satin would. At her throat sits a brooch with hair, tightly braided under crystal, the color indistinguishable from her own hair in this monochrome world. There is a ribbon at the girl's upper arm, black as a bruise. On the father's coat sleeve, a mourning band binds his bicep with a line of black that is not part of the suit. From the girl's hair, I now see that the little sprig pinching at her attention is not decorative folly but a small, precise memorial, perhaps a weeper bead, perhaps a black-edged ribbon. The veiled mirror on the sideboard is an old superstition turned household practice. Cover the glass so that sorrow does not get trapped, or souls, or light. I had thought it merely a clever way to avoid the camera catching itself. Now it speaks. I imagine the room where this was taken. This very room, not a studio. A parlor where someone has moved the chairs into a plan and, before clearing them, thrown a cloth over the mirror so that the father does not have to see himself. Grief is a stage thing. It needs a script, and the Victorians had one. I look again at the flowers. Lilies like the ones that perfume anterooms thickly until grief itself smells like them. There is rosemary too, sprigs of it threaded into the girl's fingers, remembrance and its bitterness. The vase is heavy, glass cut to flash. On the carpet, near the boy's polished shoes, a fallen petal lies like a piece of a cloud that has tried to land. I pin it with a red circle in the digital file, and then I make my corrections, not to remove it but to draw it out so that it is not forgotten. A gentle curves adjustment on a non-destructive layer lifts the shadows so that the faintest mark becomes legible. I do not dodge or burn with certainty. Everything I do on layers I can switch off so that the image can return to itself as easily as I can arrive at it. The sixth sign is a technical one masquerading as a historical clue, the ways a studio props its dead and its living differently. By 1899, many postmortem photographs were taken at home, where the dead were dressed and laid and kissed and left for the camera while the room smelled of crepe and soap. In those images, a posing stand is pointless. Weight is meant to be held by furniture and the arrangement of limbs. In a studio where the living keep still, the stand is an insurance policy against wiggles and boredom. The faint shadow of the stand behind the father is visible under the raking light. Behind the boy, as I enhance the midtones with a careful S-curve, an impression on the seat of the chair he stands beside becomes apparent. I thought at first he stood on the floor. Now I see a tufted ottoman half under his feet, and the line of his heels is not even with the carpet pattern. His weight is not on the floor. It's on the object, but the crease at his trouser knee is wrong for a living hinge. I experiment with inversion for a moment, a digital negative to see if the change in perception reveals any edits. The back edge of his coat has been retouched to curve naturally away from the body. A small brush left faintly repeating half-moon strokes where it softened an angle into a human shape. Someone used the pencil with care. I set that layer aside. Photographers did not always rest easy with what they did. They were midwives to memory, sometimes they were undertakers. The seventh sign is, and always will be, the inscription that nobody meant to leave and that the camera captured by accident. Jewelry that speaks the dates of mourning. A ribbon pinned in the wrong place. A piece of paper in a pocket. I zoom into the mother's breast, to the brooch that caught my eye early. The hair inside, woven into a complexity of pattern that you could not accomplish without the practice of grief, is lighter than her own. It looks like a child's hair. Fine, perhaps a pale blonde that the emulsion has rendered soft gray. Behind that, there is a pin on her collar that is not decorative, a small oval with the words that children of this era learned to read before they learned to write. In memoriam. On the sideboard, on top of the crocheted mat, there is a calling card with a border of black, and beside it a lock of hair coiled like a comma. I would not have seen these without increasing local contrast through a masked layer. They were there, but they were swallowed by the flattening of time. I sit back and let my eyes unfocus. All seven hum together like a chord. But I am not done. The technique is the spine of this work, and out of respect I let it stand. I approach the restoration gently. The cleaning of the scan is next. I avoid the addictive power of the cloning tool because the healing brush's algorithms can blur history. I sample carefully and only on a new layer labeled dust/marks. Never on the original or on any adjustment that would make undo impossible. Tears are easier digitally than in life. I ease the long crack by borrowing texture from adjacent carpet and then reintroduce the micro-crazing I have smoothed so that the print does not look like a digital cartoon. I correct for lens curvature the old studio used by matching verticals. The sideboard was built plumb, and it shall stand plumb again. I correct for oxidation by building a split curve, lifting the highlights slightly to address silvering edges and pinning the midtones so they do not puckering. When I reduce noise I do it locally. Grain is the breath in this lung, and to empty it would be to kill it. The blacks are rich again, the mother's crepe so matte that even on my screen it appears to swallow the room. I step away as I always do to keep from doing too much. The room makes its cage of quiet again. My chair creaks, and the banister outside my office complains to nobody. I pick up a book from my desk, one of the reference volumes I return to for anchorage. Etiquette manuals and mourning guides, period catalogs for jewelers that sold hair work, records from late 19th century undertakers that list what a household ordered and in what sizes. The language is a liturgy. Full mourning for a widow, a year and a day in crepe, followed by second mourning with more luster, and half mourning that admits gray and lavender back into a world that has begrudged them. Children bleed into their grief differently, the texts say, swifter to color, but always pinned with reminders. A black ribbon, a white one if a baby has gone. The girl's ribbon is black. The boy's boutonniere is white. I do not consider coincidence a credible defense in matters like these. I return to the image and begin a comparative layer exercise. Side by side, I set images of similar era portraits for my own eye to recalibrate what to expect. In healthy family portraits of the time, there is often a warmth of entropy. A wrinkle, a mischievous glance, a hand that will not behave. In those taken after, even when the living are instructed to look normal, the room has an altered gravity. They hold themselves as if someone has taken the oxygen out of the air and the only way not to choke is to keep your limbs still. The mother's mouth here has the careened slant of a woman who might have smiled if she were not afraid that the act would break her face. There is one more thing that the scanner cannot see that a camera might. Ultraviolet reveals what the eye misses. It can bring out erased pencil, and it can show the residue of organic materials differently. I take a UV torch to the print cautiously and sweep the light at a distance so that I do not bake the binder. Under the UV, the ink of the studio stamp on the back flares, and beneath the rubbed writing a new line floats like something found underwater. Taken after the fever took our boy, it says in jagged capitals, the lower half of the letters faded back into the pulp. The word boy is underlined twice. I put the light down and I sit there for a while until the room reconciles itself around those words. It is what I suspected, what the checklist had built towards, but the confirmation is a different animal. A sentence can break a photograph into two truths: what the camera saw and what we now cannot unsee. I return to the screen and take a new path through the image, and along that path I find things that 20 minutes earlier had been only decor. The ottoman is not merely there to adjust a child's height, it supports what will not stand. The girl's hand holds not only rosemary but also, if you adjust the contrast under her fingers, a ribbon that binds a lock of hair. The mother's brooch contains a different child's hair. It is too long, too thick for the boy, and the coil on the mat is a duplicate, a sister lock not yet braided into memory. The lilies, heavy-headed, are the kind undertakers favored because they were fragrant enough to argue with reality. The mirror under muslin shows nothing but a block of light, and yet if you push the levels gently and then quickly, you can tease out the ghost of the room beyond: a photographer's hat on a peg, a coat folded across a chair. I know it is an artifact of reflection and the mischief of adjustments. I have no appetite for making ghosts out of noise. But even knowing this, I cannot keep myself from flinching when, at a particular value, a shape at the edge of the veiling appears like a hand, the fingers pale. I take my own hand off the mouse and I count to 7. Fear is not a method. I reset the layer to a sane place and continue. There is work yet that is practical and not haunted. To prepare this for my client, I will deliver 2 iterations. One to look at, one to learn from. The look version will be the cleaned, toned, respectful correction that makes the image watchable without insisting too loudly on its damage. The learn version will be a forensic guide overlaid with the map of evidence, each of the 7 signs marked gently, the notes of process appended, the choices made on the layers explained. I label my layers like one labels drawers in a new house: curves, global, levels, edges, healing, dust only, contrast, local micro, silvering, controlled, color cast, neutralize warm, unsharp mask, low radius. I keep the original scan always visible at the stack's bottom. It is the ground upon which all my buildings stand. I will include, as I always do, a caution with the files, that we do not erase the alterations the original maker made. I will not fix the painted eye. It is evidence, it is intention, and it is love, misplaced perhaps, but love. The studio and I argue briefly about the hour again. Somewhere in the building a floorboard surrenders a soft pop that echoes inside the walls. I save everything twice. I stand up, joints complaining in a vernacular I did not consent to, and I stretch until the spine remembers what it is for. And then, because I cannot help myself and because curiosity is cruel, I return to the reverse of the card and look for what I do not want to see. Along the left edge, in pencil graphite too light to be captured without coaxing, is a name. I read it and I wonder how often grief travels in circles. The surname matches a district registry I remember scanning months ago, where an entry in September of 1899 records a death by typhoid of a boy aged 9. I look up the index again now because the internet is an archive that we mistake for convenience. The dates sing: late August fever, late September photograph, and then winter. The name of the street is close to the studio imprint on the mount. My room goes out of focus for a second that is longer than it should be. My own grandmother told stories of a house on a neighboring street where a window was never opened for years. And grief, like mold, can bloom across masonry. I go back to the image and I look at the boy differently, not as a symbol, not as a sign, but as a person whose father shaved him that morning and whose mother buttoned his cuffs with the gentlest of fingers so that he would not catch his sleeve and embarrass himself in front of the camera. I imagine the photographer arriving with his equipment, the smell of leather and oil with it, the cumbersome polite talk that tries to make a tent of normal around a family that will not fit inside it. I imagine the way the father paid, coins counted carefully, and the way the man behind the lens did not say the thing he thought. There are rules to grief. There are greater rules to kindness. I flatten nothing. The file remains a stack, decisions visible all the way down to the emulsion. In the margins of my notes I write the 7 signs plainly for the client, not as sensationalism but as an anatomy: the paint at the eye, the gaze that does not land, the rigid hands and the ottoman's support, the gravitational center steering the composition, the stand behind the living but not the dead, the uniform of mourning in crepe and jet and bands, the tokens and the room's behavior, flowers and veiled mirror, hairwork and a card edged in black. I add a note that this is consistent with a post-mortem commemorative portrait, taken at home, likely with a short exposure given the clarity and the crispness of the child's hair. I do not pretend at absolute. I sign the report where it is proper for me to sign it, with the quiet equation of evidence and restraint. While the files render into the formats my client's software will heed, the studio softens further around me. Outside somewhere a bus exhales. The radiator does its slow regular seethe. I pull the original card closer to the light and I look one last time with my naked eye, without the barrier of pixel and glass. It is different like this, less precise and more human. The paint on the eyelid is less obvious, almost an error instead of an intervention. The shadow under the girl's cheek makes her look younger. The father's watch chain is a line of optimism I wish I had known him to deserve. The mother's mouth is not hard now, it is careful, like the seam on a garment that has been unpicked and laid flat to rest. The boy looks back at me until I can feel my throat fall in on itself, and I do the worst thing, the thing I tell myself not to do. I imagine his last breath. I imagine the cold hand of water and bad milk and careless hands that did not wash when they should have. And then I close my eyes and I imagine him running instead because I am not a coroner, I am what happens after. When I open my eyes again, my monitor tells me through its small icons that everything is ready. I save the 2 versions to a drive that I have named for a poet, and I write the email that will travel faster than the heavy silence the family carried. I put into words what the eye could not be sure of and what the light told me anyway. I tell the client what I have found and I am kind about it. I say that I can send them both versions now and I always ask, if they would like me to include the unaltered scan as well so that they can hold it in their hands and decide what to hold on to. People believe that removing the scratches removes the loss they represent. It does not, but I will not decide that for them. Before I close the folder, I am caught by one last thing, which is not a sign but a superstition of my own. Every now and then, when I push a certain sequence of adjustments in a certain way, the reflections in glass that are not reflections at all become transiently legible. Not real. Not true. Just legible in the way that a cloud can be a dragon if you need it to be. I have not allowed myself that here. I have stayed between the guardrails of recovery and report. But my hand, roguish, takes me to the veiled mirror again, and I roll the curve that I know will tease out the ordinary ghost, the studio lights, the shadow of the man with the hat. At the farmost edge, the veil hangs in heavier folds, and in that heaviness the suggestion again, the hand that isn't. I breathe out and I flatten the test layer without saving it. We do not need this. I put the original card back into its sleeve, one of the mylar ones that pretends to be glass and yet keeps the world at bay. I lay a sheet of acid-free paper over it like a blanket. I place it in the outgoing tray with other histories that will find their families, and the studio gives its last groan of the night. Before I turn out the light, I turn to the camera that watches for the channel and I tell it what I will tell you now, that the work of restoration is the work of holding breath alongside the dead and then letting it out in such a way that the living can breathe again. The checklist is a lamp. The evidence is a map. But the journey is always the same, from the surface of a photograph to the room where it was made, and from there into the pulse of a house that was not ready to be quiet. If this kind of watching matters to you, if you want to see how we coax truth from paper without breaking its bones, how we recognize mourning in a seam and fidelity in a brushstroke, then subscribe. There are more rooms to enter, more mirrors to veil, and more voices caught in silver that need us to learn how to listen.